Welcome to Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. I invite you to join me on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful as a participant in the great conversation, and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education. My guest today is Master Teacher Mariah Martinez. I've known Mariah for many years, and she's on the beautiful teaching team. And I invited her here today to discuss two types of classical pedagogy, and she will be presenting this in our conference this weekend. She is a graduate from Houston Christian University. She graduated with a double major in the honors program. She also completed her Master's of Classical Education and Humanities from the University of Dallas. So I'm so thankful that Mariah is here today, and I'm excited to introduce you to her and for her to share with you a lot of really interesting, insightful ideas that she has implemented at her school in the Founders Classical Academy of Tyler, Texas. So what we want to dive into today is classical pedagogy. You and I guess it was a year or two ago, you were texting me, asking me, so how many kinds of classical pedagogy would you say there are? And we were texting back and forth, and we decided that there's really just two. But within those two, there's a few subcategories. And so I think that our listeners will enjoy hearing the details about this. And I know that you can speak to it very, very well. But I want to start with you explaining what you shared with me about David Hicks from his Norms and Nobility book, and how he says in that book that in order to have good pedagogy, you must have good anthropology. So explain to our listeners what that means and what that entails.
Yes. So Norms and Nobility, phenomenal book. In really the first couple pages, he starts out with something that may have been obvious to most people, but I was reading it, and I was like, that's such a brilliant insight. I wish I'd thought of that. This idea that in order to give somebody a good education, ultimately you have to understand what they are. Especially because we have to answer the question, what are we educating people for? What is the goal of what we're doing? And really, in order to understand the goal, you have to understand who you're teaching. And so he has this quote in the first couple pages where he says, education at every level reflects our primary assumptions about the nature of man. And I started thinking about that and how very true that is. So in order to have a good education, you have to have a good understanding of what a human being is. And you can see this reflected in our culture in a negative way, because there are lots of different kinds of education that have sort of popped up in America in particular. And a lot of them start with a false anthropology. So they don't have a good view of what a person is. And because they don't have a good view of what a person is, their methods tend to be destructive at worst and incomplete at best. So like as an example of that, if you have the idea, like John Dewey did, that man is sort of this like product of social forces that we're just sort of made by the society in which we live, you get what a lot of progressive education has become. It doesn't matter necessarily what's best for you. What matters is what's best for the local society where you live. So poor rural children don't need to read Shakespeare, because what use would that be for them? Instead, they need a lot of ag classes or things that will help sort of their local economy. I just read an article recently, and I can't remember who wrote it. Unfortunately, I can look that up. But the whole point of it was people shouldn't be panicking about the state of education, because it doesn't matter that, people can't tell you who the first president of the United States was or what the capital of the United States is, because they can just Google it.
Mm.
They don't need to know those things. Uh, they need to know how to use technology, or things like that. And so, right, it starts with a false anthropology that you're just sort of this bundle of things that happen to you in the place where you live. And it leads to an incomplete education. You also see it, if there's this idea in America that man is like a radical individual where, nobody should have any say over you, including society or your family or other people. You get to decide who and what you are. Sometimes in the most extreme sense of that, even your biology sometimes doesn't have a say over you. And what you see, and I've noticed this being in administration recently, is there's this push, um, basically to give every single child their own learning track. Um, and there's a system we use in Texas to rate teachers, and it's called T-test. And there's a section where you're supposed to rate them on something called differentiation, which is how they're meeting the needs of every student in the classroom. And if you look at it the way the rubric is written, it's literally impossible for a human being to get the highest score on there, because it's basically assuming that each child has their own lesson plan that the teacher is implementing, which is really something that can only be done by a computer.
Right. I was just thinking that. I was just thinking,
Yeah,
this sounds like the only way you could do this would be with an online program.
which I think is the ultimate goal of this style of thinking, is that every single student has their own path, and they're doing it with AI lessons on computers. And then if there's a human being in the room, they're sort of there as like a cheerleader, taskminder, babysitter. And so, I mean, like, and this is a movement in American education. So, and it again, it starts with this idea that there is nothing that we really have in common, and that the best thing for people is to be on their own sort of path.
It's interesting because it seems to me that this could be a very appealing model to parents who feel like their child does need that sort of individualized attention or individualized instruction. But I think that maybe parents need to be aware of what ultimately this is saying, like the ultimate message that they're getting from this, although it may sound really good, is actually going to potentially put their child into an abysmal experience.
Well, and this is interesting because we've actually seen a rise in this kind of thing since COVID. You hear a lot about how a lot of parents have pulled their kids from the school system to homeschool, but what you don't hear is what that homeschooling actually ends up being, because
Mhm.
it's because there's a very good kind of homeschooling, right,
Yes,
where
right.
it's very family oriented, and the parents are involved, and they're teaching their children all these great, wonderful, beautiful things. But a lot of these kids that are getting pulled from the system, both parents work, and so what they're ending up doing is being on these sort of self-paced online programs, and they sit at home alone all
Mhm.
day on their computers by themselves doing these self-paced online programs. um, and I have personally seen students, from the school where I teach, get pulled to do that, um, and then when you hear about what has happened to them afterwards, it is never good. They
Mm.
are never well adjusted or happy. Usually, the next time I see them is uh, because they got busted for something that they shouldn't have gotten busted for, which isn't to say if you pull your kids and put them on an online program, it's like a pipeline to a life of crime and degeneracy. But right, being isolated, being alone all day, it's not good for you. Being on a screen all day by yourself, it's not good for you. This is not what, back
Right.
to Hicks, this is not what man was meant to do.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that you that you used the example of crime that they got busted for doing something bad because they were probably just bored, you know. Uh,
Absolutely.
the other it also reminds me I recently read Crime and Punishment actually for the first time ever, and there was a part in the book, which I'm sure you've read this book. um, there was a part towards the end of Crime and Punishment where he's sort of assessing himself for why he did this crime, and he's realizing that part of the reason he did this crime is because he was pent up in this little tiny apartment for so long. And he was, doing this academic track that was so intense, seeking this massively great doctorate degree or whatever. He was studying law or medicine. I can't remember. I think law. And anyhow, he was just so, it drove him into such a self inflicting depression that he haunted his own self into committing a crime because he wasn't in communion with people. He wasn't in a community, if you will. And so I think you've tapped on something really important that we are facing, and I hadn't realized how bad it was until like just now talking to you that wow, I guess being in the classroom at a school, you would see the repercussions of this. So you've got these kids that they leave and then they come back, and that's really, really scary. Um, and I get the parents are well meaning. I think even the model, in a sense, can be a well meaning model. But I think that if we lose sight of the importance of community, and like you said, even homeschooling, I homeschooled my children, but we were in community. We weren't
Yeah.
isolated. We didn't even have computers. But, there, and I took them places. We didn't just stay home and never go anywhere. We, we did things. We participated in community activities. We went to church. The kids were in sports, one at a time. I couldn't handle doing four kids running them at four places all at once, but they all got to take their turns being in something: piano, soccer, ballet, whatever. So, I think you're right. I think that this is a very, very detrimental model. And for parents to be aware of thinking about the anthropology, what is man and how that's going to influence the education they receive. That's really, really good insight. Um, what else do you want to add to this anthropology idea?
Well, and I think the good news for people is we know what the correct anthropology is, especially from, I don't want to say a Christian perspective because that makes it sound like there's more than one option. But I mean the truth in Christianity shows us what human beings are, and so we know and we have known how to properly educate people for thousands of years, which is comforting. We're not having to. This isn't really a brave new world. We're not having to make this stuff up from scratch. So Aristotle had the insight that man was a rational animal created to be in a political community, and then Christianity finishes that and perfects it by noting that we're creatures created in the image of a perfect and holy God, created ultimately to do work for his glory.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so if you kind of take that sort of view, that what's the goal? Well, the goal is to create, not to create, to come alongside families as schools, to help uh, mold these sort of well ordered souls and well ordered minds in accordance with that human nature. So it is very communal, right? Because we're it in Genesis, right? And it's talking about marriage, but it's a general principle. It's not good for man to be alone. We are meant to be with one another. Um, Good education is communication centered. You
Hmm.
have the trivium, the quadrivium, word and number. Word is how we communicate with each other and how God communicates with us, but also number. Number is how the language that God used to create the universe, and it's how we can understand that side of it. I think it was Augustine who talked about the two books. You have the book of Revelation and the book of nature, and they're both important. It's creative, right? We're mandated to fill the earth and subdue it, to create societies and civilizations. And so the sort of Judeo-Christian perspective on this is the one I believe that really captures the full nature of humanity. And because it captures the full nature of humanity, it gives us the pedagogy that we need in order to create these well ordered souls and minds.
So let's get into these two types of pedagogy, because I'm sure some of our listeners are thinking there's only two. But you and I really broke it down to, yeah, there's
Yeah,
two. And within those two, there are a few variations. But why don't you go ahead and tell our listeners what those two are, and then break down, how they operate.
absolutely. So the two main types of classical pedagogy are mimetic instruction and Socratic instruction. And so mimetic meaning to imitate, to copy. And then Socratic is, well, we can get into that a little bit more in a minute, but that's the sort of combining language and reason part of it. So we can start with mimetic because I think that's how we just start to learn generally as human beings. And it's very easy to see if you look at infants, because this is what they do. And so we talked about, there are three sort of subcategories of mimetic instruction. And one of them is just, I guess in a classical classroom, we would call it copy work, but really what it is just imitation. Because this is what we do. This is how we learn. The baby will mimic the sounds that the parents make in order to learn how to speak. When you want to fix your sink that's broken, you pull up a YouTube video and try to do the same thing that the guy in the YouTube video is showing you how to do. When you learn how to play an instrument, you mimic the sounds that the instrument is supposed to make. And so sort of at bottom, a lot of what we do to learn in the beginning is imitation. And so, in the classroom, it makes sense that this is a tool that you would use, not just with young students, although it's easiest to see with the young students, because when you want to teach them how to write, what do you have them do? Right? They sit down with their little things and they like trace over the letters until they can make them on their own. But it's no different for a high school student. Some of our kids are in physics right now, and they're doing a project where they have to like apply sort of everything they've learned to build something. So a lot of them are making siege weapons because that's a fun thing to do.
What
So we've
kind?
got
What are they making?
siege weapons, so like giant crossbows and like catapults and stuff.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, they go and like test them out on the field, and I have to remind them not to aim them at people or cars. But the way they learn how to do that is, watching the movements that their teacher makes when he's showing them how to like apply certain principles. They will like look things up on YouTube and like, again, copy the movements. And then once they have sort of the skills down through that imitation, they're making their own adjustments. They're making their own calculations, applying the things that they've learned how to do.
But they're starting with a good model.
Yes, they start with a good model, right? And so kindergarten to 12th grade, right? Imitation and beyond, right? Into adulthood. Imitation is sort of the foundation of I would say pretty much all things we learn how to do. And so it's super, super important. So that's one of the subcategories of mimetic instruction. And then another one, Charlotte Mason did a really good job of explaining and describing, is narration, which is sort of training your ability to pay attention and to retain what you've paid attention to, which I think we've discovered is an incredibly valuable thing to be able to do, especially in a world where more and more people are losing that power of attention, um, even into adulthood.
Hmm.
Um, I've always said that one of the worst things I ever did was get a smartphone, because I definitely noticed that it has impaired some abilities that I had gained while I was younger. Um, so, narration, you listen to the beautiful works and words. She describes it as giving children a feast, and then you retell the story. So you're internalizing and then sort of cementing it in your soul through that retelling.
Hmm.
Um, and even that's a sort of imitation, right? Because this is sort of the idea behind mimetic instruction, because you learn to imitate proper diction and proper syntax when you retell what you just heard.
Hmm.
Um, and it doesn't have to be word for word, um, but there's still sort of that um, internalization of what good language sounds like
Right.
with narration. And then finally, you have memorization / recitation. It's really more recitation is sort of the end goal there. And so that's just the art of taking in those beautiful words and ideas and then being able to present them in a beautiful way.
Hmm.
Um, and so, I think, again, people have been doing this for thousands of years, but it fell out of favor in education, but it didn't fall out of favor in the churches. Because I don't ever remember having to memorize anything when I was in school, but I did at church,
Hmm.
because you would learn Bible verses. Um, and I think the churches had exactly the right idea, right? You hide the words of God in your heart, um, and then they become part of who you are. They become part of, your mind and your soul, and you can have them when you need
Hmm.
them, which is incredibly valuable. And so it's you do it with the Bible, and a lot of homeschool co-ops and Christian schools will do this. They will make their students memorize Bible verses, but you can also do it for poetry, um, for monologues from plays, just from beautiful passages from books, and it all just becomes part of who you are, and then you say it, and you say it in a way that is worth listening to, and so you're building all of these linguistic skills,
Hmm.
with mimetic instruction.
Right. So your mimetic instruction, you have the three kinds: narration, the memorization and recitation, and the imitation. Those three
Mhm.
is um, your main subcategories. I like how you described each one. If you don't mind, can I share with our listeners?
Sure.
So Mariah did a really nice job at summarizing each. So she has narration as the art of attention and retention, memorization and recitation as the art of internalization and oration, and then imitation as the art of reproduction leading to genuine production. I think those are excellent summaries of the three types of mimetic instruction. So I think then once we kind of wrap up that these are the main three types of mimetic instruction, one of the things I'd like to point out is that these are all very natural methods of learning, and they go back to thousands of years. This is how we know people have learned throughout time, throughout history. Um, there's no magical process to mimetic instruction. It's just the natural way that we learn, the natural way we form our souls and our minds, and teaching students in this way is an art. It's an art because you have to attend to your students and you have to walk them through the process of learning these skills And you as a teacher have to become skilled at doing that and
Yeah.
at being attentive to where your students are, what their needs are, what's the next step that they're ready to advance in within these methods. So then we go from mimetic instruction to Socratic instruction. So tell our listeners a little bit more about what that means and what that looks like.
So this one probably more people are familiar with. Um, but so Socratic instruction is really about um, the proper formation of the mind. So it's almost like a second step, because you have to have the foundational skills that you get with mimetic instruction. So you have to have all the background knowledge. You have to be able to think well, to speak well, in order to do Socratic education well. And that looks different and in different grades. I think a lot of people think that, like, oh, I can't do this with my kindergartners. But it's something that they'll do in high school. It's actually not true. Um, what something being well reasoned for a kindergartner like is looks different than what a well reasoned response for a 12th grader would be. But kindergartners are smart. They can uh, come up with all sorts of um, incredibly rational lines of thought.
Hmm.
Maybe not in ways that you want them to, but they're definitely capable of this sort of thing at their level. And so there are two sort of kinds of Socratic instruction. And the first one is Socratic questioning. And this one's actually probably like the most pure Socratic method, because if you actually go back and read Platonic dialogues, this is what Socrates largely does. He doesn't really have discussions with people. He will ask them a few questions. They'll give some answers. He'll poke holes in their answers. And then you get to the yes, Socrates, of course, Socrates. It couldn't be any other way, Socrates portion.
Right.
Um,
His dialogues are so fun to read.
they are.
They make me laugh.
I mean, that's kind of the pattern they all follow. Like, people think that they're about to get into a debate with Socrates, and then he's like,
Uh,
no, I'm going to say things and you're going to agree with me.
Yeah. Well, he just does it through all these amazing questions. You're like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, you just went there, didn't you?
Yeah, exactly. And so you can do this with students as well.
Hmm.
And so it's very controlled, because it's really about a teacher guiding and forming the reason of the participants. So you'll ask some questions, and the students will have a lot of freedom in the beginning to answer the questions in the way that seems best to them. And if their answers are well reasoned and correct, there's not much more you need to do except agree with them and move them on to the next step. If they're not, then you can use questioning to sort of bring them to the realization of their own errors.
Hmm.
And then you use questions to bring them from that realization of error into a realization of the truth. And so you see this, the famous one is the Meno, where he has a slave boy come forth, and he asks him questions, and this boy has no education, he's illiterate, but through questioning he gets him to solve math equations, geometric equations, or it
Yeah,
wouldn't be
it's a geometry problem.
proof, yeah,
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah,
something
yeah.
like that. um
Neither of us are mathy. We're both literary.
no.
We're more on the trivia end, right?
Yeah. Everybody does this, and the questions that he asks allows the boy to use his innate reason, right? Because as a human being, we all have reason, to solve these problems, even though he has no formal education. And Plato comes to the wrong conclusion, actually. He's like, see, this boy has an eternal soul and carries all knowledge within himself already. And so our goal is just to unlock the knowledge that's already there, which we believe as Christians that human beings have immortal souls, but not eternal souls. We don't actually have all of the knowledge inside of us already. But we do all possess reason, and reason can be trained and guided. And so I enjoy Socratic questioning. It's one that is really good for everyday sort of use in a classroom. Um, and I think it's something that people just do kind of naturally, um, because it's just a great way to make sure that they're paying attention and thinking about things in the way they should be thinking about them.
Yeah, and it keeps them on their feet, and the whole class becomes
Yeah.
interested. Like, oh, yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it gets a lot of students engaged.
Yes, it does. So especially if you do cold calling, so they're never quite sure who's going to be asked to answer a question. That can definitely change a dynamic in a really positive way.
Hmm.
It was kind of funny. We modeled a lot of these for our teachers this summer, and the one that gave them like the most anxiety um, was actually Socratic questioning, because we did cold calling and they didn't know if they were going to be called on or not. And I was like, y'all do this to your kids all the time. So it's all fair. Um, and then that kind of takes us to uh, the second form of Socratic instruction, which is the one everybody knows about, which is Socratic discussion or Socratic dialogue. Um, and this is like a more advanced version. Um, and it's essentially what people think it is. It's where you all sort of sit in a circle and you have the teacher who is the leader of the discussion, but is not dominating the discussion. So the students come together and use the things that they have learned, the things that they have read, to answer questions, to dig into a topic in a deeper and more meaningful way. And it's a communal task, and it's also very difficult to do because it takes time. So there's like a logistical aspect to it, because you have to set the classroom up in the right way, and you have to make sure everybody knows all the rules of the discussion, and that there's not just one person dominating the conversation. And then it takes a lot of prep work actually from the teacher if you're going to do it well, because you can't just come in and be like, all right, talk to me.
Right.
That's nothing. Or you have to actually have like good questions. Um, and then it also has, you have to make sure that you have good leaders as well, because it is very easy for a group of people to fall into error about something.
Mhm.
Um, And if one person has fallen into error on a topic, it's a little bit easier to persuade them that they're in error. If a whole group has decided that something is true when it's not true, it can be a little more difficult to persuade them um, that they together have maybe not come to the correct conclusion. So you have to definitely be paying attention as the leader and making sure that the discussion stays relevant and stays um, focused on finding truth and not on doubling down on error. So it can be very difficult to do. But again, a lot of people think that this is just for high school students or college students, and it's really not. I've done it with first graders.
Mhm.
It looks very different with a group of 7-year-olds than it does with a group of 18-year-olds. But um, you know, if you've really worked with smaller children on how to do it, um, and you've all read a work together and you've discussed the work and you make sure everybody understands it, then they're capable of having deeper conversations about it.
Mhm. That's true. It's true.
I'd like to take a quick break to remind you that this weekend is our first classical education online conference, and Mariah Martinez will be speaking at a few of those sessions. She'll be doing one, expanding even more on the idea of these two types of classical pedagogy. And she'll also be teaching an interesting workshop called Recitation and Rhetorical Art for pre-K through 12. Many people don't think of rhetoric as something that you teach when they're young, but rhetoric is a part of recitation. And so she's going to talk a little bit about the difference between memorization and recitation and what kinds of things our students should be reciting and what that looks like at the various ages. She also is going to be teaching some great courses this fall through our CourseStorm application. In addition, many of our other beautiful teaching instructors are going to be offering lots of classes this summer and fall, and those are all at our website where you can register for the conference. So the website for that is beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com. That's beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com. So if you listen to this podcast and it's too late to register for the conference because the conference is June 27th and 28th, check it out because we have dozens of classes this fall. We've added new instructors, and we have a lot of really interesting courses that are up there now. So check out our website for registering for any of our courses this year. Again, beautifulteaching.coursestorm.com. And now we'll return to the show and the interview with Mariah. Thanks for listening.
So since we started working together 7 years ago, 8 years ago, I was helping the school you're at to kind of transition into classical.
Mhm.
And so you've been with those students now for 7 years, 8 years?
This is going on 8 years.
Yeah. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about what you've noticed in the students that have been there for the 8 years
Mhm.
and compared to sort of what happens to new students as they're coming in to the school?
So the thing that's always been fascinating to me is not necessarily what the advanced students do, because there are always a group of students who are like incredibly intelligent, like very gifted, very motivated, and they're the ones who are going to do well no matter where they are. Although I think they get more out of a classical education than they would otherwise. Um, but what's always been more interesting to me are those students who are in the middle or lower end of the spectrum. Um, because what I've seen with, uh, I'm thinking about our junior class right now in particular, some of them have been there since our school opened. So they started in kindergarten and they'll graduate next year, having been there for 13 years, which
Mhm.
is longer than I've been there. Um, and what's been fascinating to me is looking at those students who I guess you would describe as average and what average looks like with this education versus what average looks like without this kind of education. Um, because I think those students have thought about things that they never would have thought about before. They've read things that they never would have read otherwise. They've had skills developed that they never would have otherwise. And so you get a group of kids who maybe would have fallen through the cracks somewhere else, but who, with a classical education, are well read, well spoken, can talk to you about anything. Um, they can write well. Um, they they can even do things like draw and paint well, and they understand music better than I ever
Mhm.
could. And it's all of these things, and they're not geniuses. They're just normal people. But this is what normal people should be like.
Yes, right. Because they've been given a good, full, steady diet of living ideas in order to grow intellectually, and their moral and intellectual formation has been able to flourish.
Yes.
Right.
And so, you get conversations at lunchtime. All of our kids get a 30-minute recess period, um, even in high school. And so last year they were reading some Dostoevsky. And so, again, these are not like the nerdy kids. They're the ones who do have TikTok and enjoy it and, are worried about like makeup and fashion, which are all fine. But they would like go off, they would have this little tree during recess and they would sit down at the tree and, you'd walk past, um, and they wouldn't be on their phones. They wouldn't be doing anything like that. They'd be talking about like the ideas that they'd read in Dostoevsky and like comparing them to Shakespeare. And I was like, this is not what I talked about in high school.
Right. Right. It's beautiful to see. How are these students that have been there the whole time different from the ones that maybe come in new, maybe that have been there for 2 years versus the 8 years?
There's definitely a culture shock that you notice. Um, so if we have students who transfer in, especially if they transfer in from a public ISD, um, a lot of them struggle at first to adjust, and some of them don't adjust. And they um, I think their families wanted something different than what we offer, and they'll usually go back to an ISD. Um, some families are surprised that we actually care about the virtue of their students and not just the academics, which has always been fascinating to me. But they can struggle, and their grades typically drop a little bit that first year, especially, um, which can be jarring if you go from being an A student in an ISD to being a C student, at a classical school. But if they stick it out, um, it does take about a couple years for them to catch up to where the other kids are. But if they're motivated and if they're, I guess, open to humanity, um, they appreciate it on a much deeper level, I think, than the kids who have been there since kindergarten, because they know what it's like in other
Mm,
places. They know what they were missing.
interesting. Interesting. How do they do adapting into the pedagogy differences?
So they um they do struggle, and you can definitely and they can tell a difference between themselves and their peers. But that can be very motivating, because if you listen to the way that you sound when you're narrating something
Hmm.
and it doesn't sound like what your neighbor sounds like, um, then that can be very motivating for you to catch up.
Hmm.
And a lot of them do.
Hmm.
Um, so it's definitely very possible to go from, um, not having the sort of background in education to having it, but it does take work to catch up, because usually you come in with a lower vocabulary. Usually you come in with a lower reading level. Usually you just haven't been exposed to a lot of the background information. Like, you don't know about Greek and Roman mythology. You don't really know any Bible stories, even though you've been to church, you know, every week for your whole life. You don't know the history, and
Hmm.
so it does take some catching up. Um,
What a disservice that they've been. I mean, it's just so sad to me because they've just been spoon-fed information rather
yeah.
than having been set before a feast of ideas. Totally different. It's just such a disservice. I,
Well, what's fascinating though is that they realize that pretty quickly. And so, you always have kids, especially if you've gone to the same school your whole life. You're like, well, I want to go to a public school, for a little bit, and they'll tell them, no, don't do it. They're like, don't go to a public school. It's not worth it.
mm,
So they'll tell the kids who have been there since kindergarten, no, don't do it. And some of our kids will try. They'll like go, and then they'll come back 2 weeks later and they'll be like, yeah, no, never mind.
really interesting.
Yes, that has happened quite a few times. Um,
Wow.
yeah, it's never what they thought it was going to be, because I think, going back to the idea of like human beings as individuals, and you need to give them whatever they want. I think a lot of people are drawn to the idea of all the electives and all the different things that honestly a very large public school can offer you, um, that classical schools typically don't, on purpose, right? Because we're more focused on, these are the things that you need for the formation of your soul, um, and it's I don't know. I think being able to do whatever you want is not a good trade for being given things that actually matter.
Mm, mm. That's really
And I
good.
think a lot of kids realize that.
Hmm. Hmm. All right. Well, this was very insightful, I think. Hopefully, it'll bless our listeners to just hear that there is a pretty simple approach to the pedagogy. It's just these two categories, and you just have to learn how to do them well. Um,
Yes, that's the great news. It's actually not complicated. It's
right.
very simple and natural.
It is very natural, and I think that's one thing that I love to tell teachers is this is actually just very intuitive. And so you just kind of have to retrain your mind to go back to your intuitive nature as a human being of having conversations with
Yeah.
people, like showing them how to do something and giving them the freedom to do it well, expecting the best out of the students, and asking them to redo something if they did it sloppy in the imitation model,
Yep.
and asking them to think better and think
Yeah.
about their word choices in their Socratic discussions. So it's really about it really is truly about becoming more human,
Yeah.
becoming really all of what we are supposed to be, and to develop our human flourishing, our human nature to the potential that it was created to be. So yeah, this is great. Great. Hopefully this is good news and encouraging to teachers and parents, and even encouraging parents who maybe have older students just to consider sending their child and making the switch to a classical model, whether it be at home as a homeschool um, teacher, or whether it be enrolling them in a classical school. I think it can be a really good option for parents who you're not done. It's never too late.
Yeah. Well, and this generation of kids, um, I think feels very deeply that our culture is very empty.
Hmm.
And a lot of the things that they're being told are important aren't at all. Um, and and so I think this generation, maybe more so than my generation or the one before it, are aching for things that matter and for things that mean something. And I mean, you see this, you have a lot of younger millennials and older Gen Z kids who are becoming Roman Catholic, going to Latin Mass, becoming Eastern Orthodox, going to the Protestant Reformed tradition. They're looking for, actual theology and substance and meaning in their lives. And as much as kids will always complain about school, they want that in their education as well. They don't want to feel like their time is being wasted.
Right. Oh, that's a really good point. That's really good. And so you're seeing it as an educator, you're seeing the difference in this. That's really interesting. So tell our listeners you know how I always close my episodes, a quote that has had a huge impact on you, or a book you wish you had read sooner in your life.
Book I wish I had read sooner in my life is Jane Eyre, without a doubt.
Oh, you know that's one of my
Yeah.
favorite books.
I didn't read it until I was well into my 20s. Um, and just it's such first of all, the language is just beautiful. Um, and I appreciate it for that. But the story, the heroine, she's just so um moral, but she's not cold. Like, she's a very passionate person. And you just don't really see a lot of that in literature, really. People who don't who deny themselves because it's right. And that, I don't know, is something I wish I had known when I was a little bit younger. I maybe would have made some more self-sacrificing choices for the good,
Mm.
instead of um, pursuing my own desires and pleasures a little bit more. So
You know, it's fascinating. I don't know if I've said this on the podcast before, because I don't remember anybody ever saying that book as their one they had wished they had read sooner in their life. But I that's a book that I'm thankful that I did read early in my life. Like, I read that book in 10th or 11th grade. My literature teacher in public high school required me to read it. And that
They
was
used
not,
to do
that was
stuff like that.
back then. We actually did read good books. We
Yeah.
read Turn of the Screw, Macbeth, um, Jane Eyre, and Dickens, Mrs. Haversham, Great Expectations.
What was it? My dad was telling me back in the 70s, he took a class on like American diplomacy or whatever for one of his history credits in high school. I was like, that's a class that was required.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, everyone had to take it.
Yeah. So Jane Eyre, I would say that was one of the books. Those books I just listed were the books that made me love reading. I hated
Yeah.
reading before that. And Jane Eyre, what you just said about wishing you had read her sooner in your life, actually, it did impact me in that way. And I am glad that I did get to read her in high school because it did impact me to actually make better choices. When I was 17, 18, in my early 20s, because she is an absolutely beautiful character. And it's just, the more you read, the more you're like, oh, I want to be more like that.
Yes,
Like
exactly.
you want to, like, I want to be, it's like the virtue that she has is contagious.
Yes.
And you just like, I want to be beautiful like that. Yeah.
Yes. And I love the emphasis on, it's not that she's ugly, she's just plain.
Right.
But that's not what makes her beautiful. What makes her beautiful is her character. And that's very true.
It's such a great book. I recently was telling somebody, I just listened to the audiobook that her sister wrote, the other Bronte. It's called Agnes Grey.
Oh yeah.
Have you read Agnes Grey?
I haven't read that one yet. It's on my list.
Oh, okay. So the audiobook is fantastic, and it's much, much shorter than Jane Eyre. So it didn't, I literally listened to like the whole audiobook in one day. Uh, it is, let's see here, who read it. I want to say Juliet Stevenson, probably. She's one of my favorite. No, Virginia Leishman. So it's by Anne Bronte, Agnes Grey, and it's narrated by Virginia Leishman, Leishman. Fantastic audiobook reading. She's so good at reading it. And as I was listening to it, I thought, oh, this story needs to be read by every teacher and every parent that's sending their kids to school, because I learned in this, it was like, yeah, this is, if you listen to this book as a parent, it will make you go, I don't want to be that kind of parent. And if you listen to this book as a teacher, you're like, oh, yeah, those are all the same frustrations that I have as a teacher.
Yeah. Okay.
so, so it's a really great book for teachers and parents. But the other thing that hit me was this book actually needs to be read by like eighth graders, seventh and eighth graders, because first of all, it's shorter and the language is beautiful, but it's not quite as complex and difficult as like Sense and Sensibility and Jane Eyre, which are more like 11th grade level books.
Yeah.
So this book, I felt like this would really prepare eighth graders really well for entering into the language that they're going to need to be familiar with these more advanced classics. So I would call this more of like a sub-classic, right?
Yeah. Okay.
This Agnes Grey. It's very good, and I'm really thinking that I really want to recommend it for eighth grade.
I will bump it up on my to read list.
You're gonna like it. So, but yes, this was a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on, Mariah.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Okay.
Thank you for listening. You can get involved in a few ways. There's a Facebook page where we actively discuss the ideas around classical education. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/classical education. And if you want to help offset our production costs, you can support the podcast financially by going to www.classicaleducationpodcast.com/support. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once said, well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be in a few words this: they will know what it is to see the sky, they will know what it is to breathe it, and they will know best of all what it is to behave under it as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven.